I am Clara. I am 31 years old, and just a few short weeks ago, I sold my $350,000 home to a commercial developer, and then I simply vanished from the face of the earth. I left behind 79 missed calls. I left behind 47 frantic text messages. I left behind a blistering email from my mother with a subject line that read, "What have you done?" typed entirely in capital letters. And I left behind a desperate, middle-of-the-night text message from my younger sister that read, "Clara, there are people here telling us we have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. Where are my children supposed to go?" I did not answer her. I did not answer any of them. I did not remain silent because I am a heartless monster, but because I had spent my entire, exhausting existence answering, explaining, compromising, and accommodating. And I finally realized that my absolute best was never going to be enough for them. Before I take you through the meticulous, agonizing steps of how I dismantled my own life to save myself, please take a moment to engage with this story, but only if you truly, deeply understand what it feels like to be the sacrificial lamb of your own family. And if you are listening to my voice right now, I want to know who is out there sitting in the dark with me. Let me know where you are tuning in from and what time the clock is showing in your part of the world. Now, I need to pull you backward. I need to take you back 4 weeks to the night of our annual midwinter holiday dinner, when I stood completely still in my parents' kitchen and overheard a conversation that would permanently sever the ties of my bloodline. Growing up in my family's household, I learned at a terrifyingly young age that parental love was a highly conditional currency. I just did not possess the psychological vocabulary to articulate it back then. My father, Arthur, had spent 3 decades breaking his body at a commercial manufacturing plant before a severe spinal injury forced him into a premature, bitter retirement. He became a ghost in his own home, a man who preferred the silent safety of his worn recliner to the dangerous friction of family conflict. My mother, Eleanor, operated our household like a tiny, tyrannical kingdom where total loyalty meant absolute compliance, and daring to question her authority meant you were committing an act of unforgivable treason. And then, there was Bethany, my younger sister by exactly 3 years, the eternal baby of the family, the fragile bird who constantly needed protecting from the harsh winds of the real world. I was the strange, defective anomaly. I was the quiet child who buried herself in thick library books to escape the shouting. I was the teenager who secured a full academic scholarship to a prestigious university through sheer, relentless willpower, while Bethany casually dropped out of her local college program after 2 miserable semesters, carrying $40,000 in absolutely useless student debt. The family narrative wrote itself automatically. Clara just got incredibly lucky, they would say. Bethany just got a raw deal from life. What absolutely no one ever bothered to mention was the 4 different minimum wage jobs I juggled simultaneously to survive through university. No one mentioned the grueling, unpaid summer internships I endured while my sister took trips to the beach with her revolving door of friends. No one mentioned the aggressive corporate promotions I earned by working 80-hour weeks, while she sat in our parents' basement collecting an endless encyclopedia of excuses. But in my mother's distorted vision of reality, success was never something you actively built with your own 2 hands. Success was simply a magical weather event that happened to strike you by pure chance. And if the universe had randomly decided to smile upon me, then surely, according to my mother's logic, I owed a massive debt to those the universe had supposedly passed over. The financial extraction started in microscopic increments. It was $20 here to cover Bethany's gas tank. It was $100 there for an unexpected utility bill she had forgotten to pay. It was a sudden, urgent $500 when Vance, Bethany's husband, inevitably lost yet another entry-level job because he could not manage to show up on time. I always sent the money. I wired the funds without ever asking a single question. Looking back on the last decade of my life, I honestly cannot remember the last time my mother telephoned me simply to ask how my day was going or if I was happy. Every single conversation we shared ended in the exact same manner. A financial request, meticulously wrapped in layers of maternal guilt, delivered with the terrifying precision of a woman who had mastered the dark art of making financial obligation feel indistinguishable from familial love. I was not a daughter. I was the family's automated teller machine. I just had not read the fine print on my own existence yet. But that winter, standing in the cramped kitchen I had grown up in, the brutal terms and conditions of my life finally became crystal clear. 3 years prior to that night, I had achieved the impossible. I purchased a beautiful, 2-bedroom home in a rapidly developing, highly desirable neighborhood on the outer edge of a massive metropolis on the eastern seaboard. It featured clean architectural lines, exposed brick, and a stunning view of the city skyline that served as a daily, tangible reminder of exactly how far I had managed to climb out of the mud. I aggressively poured every single spare cent I earned into that property, taking on endless side consulting contracts and denying myself basic vacations until I completely paid off the mortgage just this past autumn. 8 grueling years of absolute financial discipline. The very afternoon I submitted that final, massive wire transfer to the bank, I sat alone on the hardwood floor of my empty living room and I wept. I did not cry from sadness. I cried from a profound, overwhelming relief. It was physical proof that I existed as an independent entity outside of what my greedy family needed to extract from me. The neighborhood surrounding my building had transformed drastically since the day I first moved in. Trendy new restaurants were opening on every block. Artisanal coffee shops occupied every corner. The local property values were climbing at a staggering, almost frightening pace. My initial $280,000 investment was currently appraised at $350,000 and likely significantly more to the right commercial buyer. My mother, with her terrifyingly sharp eye for other people's assets, had certainly noticed. Every single time she visited my home, she would drop comments that were heavily disguised as casual observations, but landed on my chest like lead weights. "You really live here all alone in all this massive space," she would sigh, dramatically shaking her head while examining my pristine guest room. Bethany's poor children are forced to share a damp bedroom that is roughly the size of your master bathroom. During a holiday dinner the previous year, she had actually physically cornered me in the hallway. "You know, my sweet girl," she whispered, her fingers digging into my arm, "if you ever felt the urge to truly help your struggling sister finally get on her feet, gifting her this property of yours could completely change the trajectory of her life." I had awkwardly laughed it off at the time. Surely, I told myself, she was just making a tasteless, exaggerated joke. She was absolutely not joking. What I was completely ignorant of at the time was that Bethany had already actively contacted the commercial developers who were aggressively buying up the older properties on my block. She had actually called them to inquire if they were interested in purchasing her sister's unit. The developers had abruptly declined to speak with her, stating they strictly did not negotiate through unauthorized, third-party intermediaries. She had been silently circling my sanctuary like a starving shark for months, and I had been entirely too distracted writing her survival checks to notice the blood in the water. The formal invitation for our annual midwinter holiday gathering arrived in my inbox in early December. "Immediate family members only," my mother had typed. "We possess so very much to celebrate this year." I should have recognized the warning signs right then and there. Celebrations in my family's ecosystem always ended up costing someone dearly, and that someone was exclusively me. The holiday dinner at my parents' house smelled exactly as it had for 30 years. Roasted meats, heavy gravies, and cheap cinnamon-scented candles attempting to mask the scent of stale air. Twinkling white lights blinked erratically along the sagging wooden porch railing. A heavily weathered, artificial pine wreath hung crookedly on the front door, the exact same wreath from my earliest childhood memories, its once vibrant red velvet bough now bleached to a sickly, pale pink by decades of harsh sunlight. Inside the house, the living room glowed with a suffocating warmth. A small, artificial tree sat crammed in the corner, dangerously weighed down with fragile glass ornaments my mother had obsessively collected over 4 decades. Classic holiday music crooned softly from a modern wireless speaker that my father still fundamentally refused to learn how to operate. I arrived precisely on time, carrying carefully wrapped gifts for every single person. I brought an imported cashmere scarf for my mother, a high-end fishing reel for my father, a massive collection of premium art supplies for my 5-year-old niece, Chloe, and an enormous stuffed dinosaur for my 3-year-old nephew, Mason. For Bethany and Vance, I brought a very generous gift card to their favorite home goods retailer. It was highly practical, entirely impersonal, and psychologically safe. Clara. My niece Chloe practically flew across the room the absolute second I stepped through the front door, her tiny arms wrapping fiercely around my knees. Aunt Clara, I drew a special picture just for you. I dropped my heavy bags and knelt down to her eye level to accept a severely crumpled piece of construction paper covered in chaotic purple crayon scribbles. It is absolutely beautiful, my sweet girl, I told her, tracing the jagged lines. Is this a drawing of a pony? It is a picture of you, she stated with absolute, deadpan seriousness. You have purple hair in my picture. I laughed, a genuine, booming laugh, and pulled her into a tight hug, breathing in the innocent, pure scent of children's shampoo and unconditional affection. Bethany and Vance arrived over 40 minutes late, loudly complaining about manufactured car troubles the second they crossed the threshold. Vance offered me a limp, dismissive handshake that felt like holding a dead fish. Bethany flashed me a smile that completely failed to reach her cold, calculating eyes. The actual dinner portion of the evening was surprisingly pleasant on the surface. We ate heavy portions of roast, garlic potatoes, and overly salted casseroles. My father mumbled the exact same 3 tired jokes he had recited for 20 years. My mother aggressively monitored and commented on everyone's portion sizes. Little Mason threw vegetables at his sister. It was a terrifyingly normal, familiar scene. But my trained auditor's eyes caught the microscopic anomalies. I caught the rapid, loaded glances exchanged between my mother and Bethany when they mistakenly believed my attention was diverted. I noticed the incredibly subtle, confirming nod of my mother's head. I watched the way Vance stealthily checked a text message under the table, then nudged Bethany's knee, showing her something on the illuminated screen that made her bite her lip to suppress a triumphant smirk. They were waiting for a specific shoe to drop. After the heavy meal concluded, I dutifully offered to handle the mountain of dirty dishes. My mother dramatically waved me toward the kitchen with a flourish of her wine glass. You are an absolute living saint, Clara. You are always so incredibly helpful to us. The kitchen was situated at the very back of the aging house, separated from the main living area by a long, narrow hallway. I filled the deep porcelain sink with scalding, soapy water, aggressively scrubbing the grease off the ceramic plates while the holiday music drifted down the corridor. And then, the music abruptly stopped. Someone had intentionally powered off the speaker. The ambient noise of the house vanished, allowing the voices from the living room to carry down the hallway with terrifying acoustic clarity. The voices were pitched low, conspiratorial, urgent. I turned the rushing faucet off, my hands freezing in the soapy water. She leaves on the second day of the new year for her business trip out west. My mother's voice drifted down the hall, crisp and sharp. She will be gone for 2 entire weeks. And Dad is already securing the spare key from her, Bethany chimed in, her tone vibrating with excitement. He is going to tell her he needs it to water her stupid houseplants and feed that ridiculous exotic fish she keeps. Vance spoke next, his deep voice laced with greedy anticipation. We really need to move fast on this. First thing in the morning on the 3rd. We need to get the moving truck backed up and get the furniture inside before her flight even lands. My hands slowly tightened around the edges of a wet dinner plate. We have to change the deadbolts immediately, Bethany continued, outlining the tactical strike. By the time she flies back and takes a cab home from the airport, we will be entirely settled in. The kids' beds will be set up. What is she honestly going to do? Is she going to call the police and have her own sister and niece thrown out into the freezing street? My mother let out a soft, chillingly cruel laugh. Clara? She will absolutely not do anything of the sort. She never does. She will cry about it. She will throw a little pathetic pout. And then she will quietly get over it and accept the new reality. She always does. That massive, beautiful space is completely wasted on a solitary woman anyway. Bethany's voice began to drip with a venomous envy that I had never allowed myself to fully recognize before. A single, childless woman hoarding a luxury two-bedroom home while my beautiful children are forced to sleep in a damp closet. Exactly, my mother agreed firmly, sealing my fate. Family fundamentally takes care of family. She will understand her duty eventually. I stood completely paralyzed in the dimly lit kitchen. The scalding dishwater was slowly turning freezing cold around my wrists. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribcage that I was absolutely terrified they would hear the rhythmic thumping from down the hall. A primal, screaming voice inside my head demanded that I march out there, shatter a plate against the wall, and demand to know how they could possibly justify stealing my sanctuary. I wanted to finally, for the first time in 31 years, bare my teeth and fight back. But I did not move. Instead, I slowly picked up the next dirty plate, submerged it in the cold water, washed it with agonizing precision, dried it with a cotton towel, and placed it perfectly inside the wooden cabinet. They falsely believed they knew the architecture of my soul. They believed I was a spineless, compliant victim. They were about to receive a devastating education. I carefully dried my hands, smoothed the wrinkles out of my sweater, adjusted my facial expression into a mask of pure, unbothered serenity, and walked back down the hallway to the living room. Years of executing high-stakes corporate risk analysis had taught me one paramount, non-negotiable rule of survival. You absolutely never show your enemy your hand until you have calculated and prepared for every single mathematical outcome. All finished in there, my mother asked, looking up from the sofa. Her smile was incredibly warm and completely, terrifyingly oblivious to the monster she was. Squeaky clean, I replied breezily, settling my body into a plush armchair situated near the glowing tree. Chloe, do you want to show me some more of your beautiful artwork? My niece enthusiastically bounced over to my chair carrying a massive stack of wrinkled papers, and I made a highly exaggerated show of examining every single one. There was a drawing of a house with thick black smoke curling from the chimney. There was a vibrant rainbow featuring 7 distinct, messy color bands. There was a portrait of a family composed of 4 stick figures, none of which featured purple hair. Out of the extreme corner of my eye, I could feel Bethany actively studying my face. Her gaze lingered on me for a fraction of a second too long. It was a suspicious, probing look. I turned my head and smiled directly at her, completely disarming her scrutiny. The roast was absolutely incredible this year, Bethany. Did you assist Mom with a complicated recipe? She blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off balance by my casual warmth. Oh, yes. I helped brine the meat overnight. You can really taste the complex difference, cannot you? My mother beamed, clapping her hands together. Crisis entirely averted. The illusion of a normal, loving family was successfully restored. But absolutely nothing was normal. Nothing would ever be normal again. I sat in that armchair, and I truly looked at them. I looked at the specific group of human beings I had spent 3 exhausting decades aggressively trying to please. I looked at my mother, a woman who fundamentally confused absolute control with maternal affection. I looked at my father, a coward who would rather silently watch his daughter be cannibalized than stand up and create a fraction of conflict. I looked at my sister, a woman who had internalized the toxic lesson that playing the perpetual victim was infinitely easier than taking accountability for her own life. And I looked at Vance, a lazy opportunist who had married into a family of emotional vampires and fit right in perfectly. They had spent my entire life viewing my quiet kindness as a terminal weakness. They viewed my silence as blanket permission to harvest me. They were catastrophically wrong. By the way, I said casually, taking a slow sip of water. I am actually meeting with my personal attorney early next week. Just finalizing some boring administrative paperwork. My mother barely even glanced up from her wine glass. That sounds very responsible, dear. She possessed absolutely no idea what kind of explosive device she had just casually dismissed. Later that evening, as the gathering was winding down, Bethany followed me out onto the back porch. The winter air was razor-sharp and freezing. I stood near the railing, wrapped tightly in my heavy wool coat, quietly watching my own breath form tiny, ghost-like clouds that instantly dissolved into the darkness. She materialized right beside me, crossing her arms tightly and hunching her shoulders against the biting chill. Just coming out here to get some fresh air, she asked, trying to sound casual. Just needed a quiet minute to breathe, I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the distant streetlights. We stood side by side in a suffocating silence for a long moment. Then, she began her interrogation. So, this upcoming business trip out west? Exactly how long are you going to be out of the state again? 2 full weeks. Must be incredibly nice, she said, her voice carrying a sharp, bitter edge she could not fully conceal. I honestly haven't been on an airplane in over 6 years. I said absolutely nothing in response to her bait. So, who exactly is watching your precious property while you are traveling? She pressed. Dad graciously offered to drop by and water my plants for me, I answered smoothly. Oh, well, that is very sweet of him. She paused, and I could feel the wheels turning in her head. Her tone became overly, dangerously casual. Your specific neighborhood is really going through a massive transition, isn't it? I drove by your street last month and I noticed dozens of commercial for sale signs everywhere. My pulse instantly quickened, hammering in my throat, but I forced my vocal cords to remain perfectly even and relaxed. Yes, there are several large commercial developers actively buying up the entire block. They are trying to bulldoze the older units and build a massive luxury complex. Has anyone approached you to make a financial offer on your place? I slowly turned my head to look directly into her eyes. I looked past the carefully constructed facade of sisterly concern and I saw the raw, pulsing envy she had spent decades trying to disguise. I saw the cold, mechanical calculation behind every single forced hug and hollow compliment. A few corporate representatives have called to ask, I said slowly, emphasizing every word. But I am absolutely not interested in selling my home. Her jaw tightened with an almost imperceptible twitch. You should really focus on taking care of your own rental situation first, I added, keeping my tone exceptionally light and breezy. Didn't you mention last week that your current landlord was being incredibly difficult about the lease renewal? Her entire body stiffened defensively. We are handling the landlord, she snapped. Good to hear. Bethany opened her mouth to say something else, then abruptly closed it. A tiny, chaotic flicker of emotion crossed her eyes. It was doubt. Perhaps the very first, microscopic crack in her absolute certainty that her plan was foolproof. But she recovered her mask quickly. Well, do not stand out here and freeze to death, she muttered. She turned on her heel and retreated back into the warmth of the house, intentionally leaving the heavy glass door slightly ajar so the cold air would hit me. I remained on the porch for several minutes longer, watching the winter stars slowly appear through the cloud cover one by one. She had come out here specifically to test my perimeter. She needed to verify if I harbored any suspicions about their impending home invasion. I had flawlessly passed her interrogation. Now it was time to initiate mine. I departed from my parents' house precisely at 9:30, executing a flawless performance of hugging every single person goodbye with practiced, artificial warmth. Drive safely, my sweet girl, my mother cooed, aggressively squeezing my shoulders. And please do not forget to drop off that spare apartment key for your father before you leave town. Absolutely, Mom, I smiled. I would not dream of forgetting. The drive back to my condo took exactly 40 minutes. I spent the first 10 miles driving in absolute deathly silence, gripping the leather steering wheel with such ferocity that my knuckles ached. When I finally reached the safety of the interstate, I connected my phone to the dashboard and voice-dialed Maya. She answered on the second ring, sounding alarmed. Clara, it is the middle of a holiday night. Is everything all right? They are actively planning to steal my home, I said, my voice finally breaking into a trembling whisper. I methodically recounted every single horrifying detail to her. I described the stealthy kitchen conversation, the casual, terrifying confidence with which they discussed changing my deadbolts, the psychological manipulation, and the spare key betrayal. Good God, Maya exhaled slowly, the shock radiating through the phone. What on earth are you going to do to stop them? I honestly do not know yet, I admitted, tears of pure frustration finally spilling over my eyelashes. You could aggressively confront them tomorrow. You could proactively notify the police to arrest them the second they try to trespass on your property. And then what, Maya? I asked, wiping my face. What happens after the police leave? I watch them weep and offer fake apologies, and then I spend the rest of my life watching my back until they orchestrate another scheme the moment I let my guard down? Maya remained quiet for a long, heavy moment. Then, what about that massive corporate promotion out west? The one the Human Resources Department has been practically begging you to accept for the past 2 months? She was absolutely correct. A highly lucrative offer had been sitting stagnant in my email inbox since late October. A position as a senior risk analyst for the Western Seaboard Division. It required a permanent, immediate geographical relocation to a rainy coastal city on the other side of the country. I had been continually postponing my final decision, constantly telling myself I simply was not emotionally prepared to abandon my life on the East Coast. But what exactly was I staying here to protect? A family that viewed me as real estate to be conquered? I have also been receiving aggressive phone calls from commercial developers, I said slowly, the gears in my mind violently locking into place. They want to purchase the entire residential block, my specific unit included. They are desperate for the land. Clara, Maya's voice dropped to an odd whisper. Are you currently thinking the exact same thing that I think you are thinking? I merged into the fast lane, the glowing lights of the city's skyline stretching out before me like a vast, undiscovered country. I have spent my entire 31 years on this planet trying to be the exact person they demanded I be, I said, feeling a strange, intoxicating power flooding my veins. I think it is finally time I figure out who I actually want to be when they are no longer in the room. The moment I walked through the front door of my condo, I dropped my bags and opened my laptop. I typed an urgent, highly confidential message to Julian Thorne, my retained real estate attorney. Julian, I need to secure an emergency meeting with you on the morning of the 26th. It is a matter of extreme urgency. I want to thoroughly discuss all of my legal options regarding this property, including an immediate, expedited commercial sale. His response materialized in my inbox within 4 minutes. I will clear my morning schedule. See you at 9. Julian Thorne's law firm occupied the 14th floor of a sleek, intimidating glass tower in the heart of the financial district. On the morning after the holiday, the massive building was eerily deserted. Clara, he said, gesturing for me to sit in a heavy leather chair across from his sprawling desk. Your late-night message sounded incredibly severe. What is going on? I told him absolutely everything. I detailed the kitchen eavesdropping, the premeditated plan to move their entire family into my unit while I was airborne, the utilization of the spare key my father was tasked to acquire, and the chilling psychological entitlement my mother displayed. When I finished my agonizing recount, Julian slowly leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Let me ensure I am legally comprehending this situation. Your family plans to actively squat in your legally owned property, change the physical locks, and present their occupation as a settled, unchangeable reality upon your return. Yes, exactly. And you are sitting here today to understand your legal options? All of them, regardless of the fallout? Julian nodded solemnly. Option number 1 is the defensive approach. You maintain ownership, travel as planned, wait until they actively commit criminal trespass, and then you dispatch law enforcement to forcefully remove them from the premises. They would be violently evicted. But, I interrupted, my stomach nodding, they would inevitably lie to the officers. They would claim I gave them verbal permission to occupy the space as a family arrangement. It instantly becomes a massive, convoluted situation of my word against theirs. Precisely, Julian agreed. The police despise inter-family disputes. They would likely declare it a civil matter. You would then be forced to drag your own sister into civil eviction court. That process takes 3 to 6 grueling months at an absolute minimum in this jurisdiction. During that entire agonizing period, they would be legally permitted to occupy your home while the court system grinds on. And I would forever be branded as the monstrous sister who called armed police officers on her weeping niece and nephew. Julian raised a skeptical eyebrow. Does their distorted opinion of you actually still matter? I thought about Aunt Beatrice. I thought about the toxic, lightning-fast family grapevine. I thought about how incredibly quickly the narrative of cruel Clara kicking Bethany's innocent babies out into the snow would spread and calcify into historical fact. It is not about what those people think of me, I said slowly, staring at the grain of the mahogany desk. It is about the massive expenditure of my own psychological energy it would take to fight them. Every single future holiday, every single family funeral, every interaction would be an endless, toxic battle. The war would never truly end. Option number 2, Julian continued smoothly, shifting his legal pad. You execute a commercial sale. The new corporate owner assumes the burden of handling any necessary evictions. You completely remove yourself from the equation. You are no longer the villain of the story. You are simply a private citizen who chose to liquidate a financial asset. The massive development conglomerate that is buying up the properties on my block, I asked, my heart beating faster. Are they still actively interested in acquiring this land? Victor Sterling's group? Julian checked his computer terminal. They're incredibly desperate. They absolutely need your specific unit to complete the geographical footprint for their luxury high-rise project. I stared out the massive floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling, gray metropolis below. If I legally sold the property to a commercial developer, I said, thinking through the logistics, anyone found illegally residing in that unit would be forced to vacate, correct? Absolutely. A standard 30-day commercial notice to vacate would be posted. It is entirely non-negotiable when municipal demolition permits are attached to the land. For the very first time in what felt like decades, I felt my lungs expand fully. Please set up a meeting with Victor Sterling immediately. Victor Sterling was an incredibly pragmatic, ruthless businessman who possessed steel-gray eyes and a bone-crushing handshake that signaled he did not entertain time-wasters. We convened in Julian's expansive conference room exactly 48 hours later. Victor unceremoniously slid a thick, glossy folder across the polished table. Miss Clara, I will be entirely direct. I am prepared to offer you 18% above the current, highly inflated market value. This is a cash transaction. We can execute a full closing in exactly 10 business days. The sheer magnitude of the number printed on the contract caused my breath to physically catch in my throat. It was a staggering amount of money. Why the extreme rush to close, I asked, narrowing my eyes. My commercial construction loan locks into a specific interest bracket on the 15th of next month. If we miss that deadline, the banking syndicate adjusts the financial terms highly unfavorably. I absolutely must possess the legal deeds to all units before that date. Julian leaned forward, tapping his pen. What is your exact protocol regarding any current occupants found inside the unit post-closing? Standard corporate procedure, Victor replied without blinking. We utilize a private legal firm to post a strict 30-day notice to vacate on the front door immediately after the closing clears. Municipal demolition permits do not legally allow for any human exceptions or extensions. I meticulously studied the dense legal contract, reading every single clause, and then I looked up to meet Victor's gaze. I believe I should be entirely transparent with you, I said. I have been privately contemplating selling for several months. I recently received a highly lucrative employment offer out west. I was hesitant to pull the trigger because this physical space held profound sentimental value to me as my first independent home. Victor nodded slowly, completely unsurprised by the emotional attachment. And now, he prompted. Now, I possess highly pressing, additional reasons to aggressively move forward. The complex family situation that Julian briefly alluded to on our preliminary phone call. Yes. I stared directly into his steel-gray eyes. If I sign this contract and sell this property to your conglomerate, I am absolutely not the entity executing the eviction. You are. Your legal team dispatches the notice. It is your corporate timeline. It is your demolition crew tearing down the walls. That is entirely correct, Victor confirmed. So, for all intents and purposes, I am simply a property owner who sold an asset to a developer and nothing more. Victor's facial expression remained completely impassive, but I caught a microscopic flicker of profound understanding behind his eyes. That is exactly the narrative the paperwork will reflect. One final question, I asked. Has any other individual contacted your office regarding my specific unit? Victor paused, consulting a digital tablet. Approximately 2 months ago, a woman claiming to legally represent her sister attempted to open a negotiation. We aggressively declined the interaction. We strictly do not conduct business through unauthorized third parties. 2 entire months. Bethany had been methodically attempting to sell the ground out from under my feet while I was still paying for her groceries. I will require until the 7th day of January to render my final decision, I stated firmly. After that specific date, your aggressive offer officially expires. 7 days. It was more than enough time for me to be absolutely certain of my path. I need to pause the narrative right here for just a brief moment. If you have ever been trapped in a dynamic where your own family treated you as an endlessly renewable resource instead of a human being, where the concept of family simply meant a lifetime of obligation completely devoid of mutual respect, I desperately want to hear from you in the comments section. What exactly do you believe I should have done in this scenario? Drop an A in the comments if you think I should have aggressively confronted my family to their faces. Drop a B if you believe I was entirely justified in executing my silent, devastating plan. I am genuinely fascinated to know your perspective. Now, let me tell you exactly how the trap was sprung. The turn-of-the-year celebration was hosted at my Uncle Arthur's sprawling, outdated house in the deep suburbs. The gathering was relatively modest by our family standards. Approximately 15 loud, overbearing relatives were crammed into a split-level house that smelled strongly of mothballs and old carpet. A flimsy folding table groaned under the weight of terrible potluck dishes, and cheap domestic champagne was chilling in a plastic cooler near the sliding back door. I arrived completely alone, carrying an expensive bottle of wine that I had absolutely no intention of consuming. Bethany and Vance were already holding court in the center of the living room, working the assembled crowd like desperate politicians at a fundraising gala. Vance's laughter was incredibly loud and deeply artificial. Bethany's smile was blindingly bright. They practically radiated the highly specific, toxic energy of people who genuinely believed they had finally successfully scammed the system. I hung back in the shadows near the kitchen entryway, quietly nursing a glass of sparkling cider and observing the spectacle. It did not take very long for the performance to begin. I possessed such incredibly exciting news. Bethany was loudly announcing to Aunt Beatrice, intentionally raising her voice so the surrounding relatives could hear. We are officially relocating to a massive new space in January. It is located in a significantly better, much safer neighborhood. The children are finally going to have their very own spacious bedrooms. Oh, how absolutely wonderful for you all, Aunt Beatrice gasped, dramatically clapping her hands together. Did you finally manage to purchase a home? Bethany's strategic hesitation lasted exactly half a second. It is a highly beneficial family arrangement, actually. It is Clara's property. She possesses all that massive square footage, and it is just her rattling around alone in there. My mother miraculously materialized right beside them, hitting her mark perfectly on cue. Clara has always been such a remarkably generous soul. You know exactly how she is. She would gladly give the shirt off her back for her family. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her words hit my system like a bucket of freezing ice water. Aunt Beatrice suddenly spotted me standing across the crowded room. Clara, your dear mother was just informing me about the incredibly gracious living arrangement. That is so remarkably sweet of you to selflessly share your beautiful home. Every single head in the living room slowly turned in my direction. My mother's eyes locked onto mine, transmitting a dark, telepathic warning that I knew intimately. Do not dare cause a scene in front of the extended family. Bethany's facial expression was one of smug defiance, silently daring me to publicly contradict her fabricated narrative. I felt the immense, crushing weight of their collective expectation. The historical assumption that I would simply fold, capitulate, and surrender my boundaries exactly as I always had. Instead, I took a slow sip of my cider and smiled brilliantly. Family fundamentally helps family, I stated simply, my voice carrying clearly across the room. That is exactly what our bloodline does, is it not? My mother's rigid shoulders instantly relaxed with a visible sigh of relief. Bethany loudly exhaled, looking incredibly triumphant. They genuinely thought they had won the war. They possessed absolutely no idea what the word family actually meant to my soul anymore. Aunt Beatrice cornered me near the dessert buffet 20 minutes later. She was my mother's older sibling, an incredibly nosy woman who collected and weaponized family gossip with the same obsessive intensity that some people collected rare coins. Her eyes sparkled with the specific, hungry gleam of a predator about to pry into fresh drama. "Clara, honey," she whispered, tightly gripping my elbow with her sharp fingers. "Please, come speak with me for a moment." I allowed her to physically guide me into a dim, quiet corner near the staircase. So she began, her voice dropping to a theatrical, conspiratorial whisper. "Your mother confidentially disclosed absolutely everything to me about you allowing Bethany to occupy your condo." "Did she really?" I replied neutrally. "You are such an unbelievably good sister. Not every young woman would possess the profound generosity to do that, you know. To completely surrender their own sanctuary. I am absolutely not giving anything up," I stated very carefully, choosing my phrasing with lethal precision. "It is significantly more of a permanent transition." Still, Aunt Beatrice shook her head, leaning in closer. "With everything poor Bethany has been forced to endure. Those precious, innocent children and that highly questionable husband of hers." She lowered her voice to a barely audible hiss. "Just strictly between you and me, I do not believe Vance will ever amount to anything more than a failure." I remained completely silent, offering her nothing to feed on. "Your mother explicitly told me that you happily agreed to this arrangement several weeks ago. She claimed it was entirely your brilliant idea." Even here, in the shadows, the toxic lie was aggressively spreading through the family ecosystem like a virulent wildfire. By the time I physically returned from my supposed business trip, the false narrative would be permanently set in concrete. Generous, compliant Clara, finally fulfilling her biological duty to the golden child. "Aunt Beatrice," I said, offering a polite but freezing smile, "I truly appreciate your deep concern. But whatever ultimately happens with my specific property is a strictly confidential matter between me and my immediate household." Her face visibly flickered with shock. Surprise morphed instantly into a flash of deep irritation at being so abruptly shut out of the drama. "Well, of course, dear. Of course it is," she stammered, awkwardly patting my arm. "I just wanted to ensure you knew that we all strongly believe you are doing the right thing." I smiled, though the expression absolutely did not reach my eyes. The right thing. These people had been aggressively dictating what the right thing was for my entire existence. I was about to show them what the right thing actually looked like when it was backed by a legal contract. Midnight rapidly approached. Somewhere in the crowded, stale-smelling house, a group of drunk relatives began shouting a countdown. But I was no longer there. I was sitting completely alone in the pristine quiet of my own condo, my laptop glowing in the darkness, the sprawling, glittering city skyline sprawling out beneath my massive windows. Fireworks would be detonating soon, loud, explosive celebrations designed for people who still believed in the myth of fresh starts. 2 highly critical emails sat waiting in my secure inbox. The first was from Julian Thorne, containing the final, unalterable digital closing paperwork. Victor Sterling's aggressive cash offer. 10 days to final closing. 30 days after that, absolute demolition. The second email was an official confirmation from the Corporate Human Resources Department regarding my massive transfer out west. Senior Risk Analyst. Western Seaboard Division. Start date scheduled for the 20th of January. Permanent, irrevocable relocation. I had been terrified to accept either of these paths for months. Terrified of what completely abandoning my geography meant. Terrified of being branded as a selfish monster. But what exactly was I violently holding on to? I slowly looked around my beautiful condo. I looked at the furniture I had assembled by hand. I looked at the sweeping. I looked at the physical proof that I was capable of building a sanctuary entirely alone. They had already stolen it from me. Not physically. Not yet. But in their diseased, entitled minds, this physical space had never truly belonged to me. It was simply an asset that I was conveniently keeping warm and well-maintained until they unilaterally decided it was time to claim it as their own. Even if I successfully fought them off and evicted them this time, they would inevitably try again next year. And the year after that. Every single holiday gathering would devolve into a hostile hostage negotiation. Every single phone call would be a deceptive prelude to another elaborate scam. This condo would forever remain a target painted on my back, and I would forever remain their personal automated teller machine unless I permanently removed myself from the equation entirely. I opened the human resources email first, typed a single, decisive sentence of acceptance, and hit send. Then I opened Julian's dense legal document. The digital clock on my laptop screen rolled over to midnight. Outside my window, massive, colorful fireworks violently exploded across the freezing winter sky, painting the clouds in bursts of neon light. I digitally signed my name on the final dotted line. I did not sign it because I was consumed by a desire for petty revenge. I did not sign it because I hated them. I signed it because I finally, truly loved myself enough to stop violently sacrificing my own future for people who only viewed my existence as a harvestable resource. I am not selling this sanctuary because of you, I whispered aloud to the empty, quiet room. I am selling it because I am finally ready to leave the cage. The encrypted document successfully uploaded to the legal server. The transaction was legally bound. Happy New Year. This one was going to be radically different. On the second day of January, I stood in the chaotic terminal of the international airport. I boarded my direct flight to the West Coast carrying exactly one heavy suitcase and a single laptop bag. Every single other possession I required would eventually be shipped to me, or it simply would not. Material objects had rapidly begun to feel incredibly insignificant. Right before the cabin doors closed for takeoff, I dialed my father's cell phone. Clara, his voice was gruff, incredibly distracted, likely overwhelmed by the secret packing occurring at his house. Are you currently at the airport? Just about to push back from the gate, Dad. You possess the spare key to my place, correct? I secured it from you yesterday. A guilty, heavy pause hung on the line. Did you need me to do anything highly specific while you were gone? Just ensure you water the large ferns. And please remember to feed Blueberry. Blueberry was my vibrant, exotic betta fish. A tiny, silent creature who had faithfully kept me company through 3 grueling years of solitary dinners. Will do, he grunted. I almost asked him the question. The words burned on the tip of my tongue. I almost said, Dad, do you fully comprehend the absolute evil they are planning? Do you even care that they are stealing from your own flesh and blood? But I already knew the agonizing answer. Arthur had spent 58 entire years aggressively avoiding any form of confrontation. He was absolutely not going to discover his spine today. Safe travels, he muttered rapidly and instantly disconnected the call. The flight spanned nearly 6 hours. I spent the vast majority of the journey staring blankly out the scratched acrylic window, watching the varied landscapes of the country scroll continuously beneath me like a massive, unspooling map. On the 3rd day of January, my phone violently buzzed with a social media notification. Bethany had uploaded a new, public story. The high-resolution image clearly displayed my pristine living room. It showed my expensive leather couch, my towering wooden bookshelf, and my sweeping view of the eastern skyline. Massive cardboard moving boxes were haphazardly stacked in the far corner. Little Mason's giant stuffed dinosaur was sitting directly on my glass coffee table. The superimposed text caption read, "A beautiful new chapter. A gorgeous new home. Feeling utterly blessed." My throat tightened painfully, but it was absolutely not from a place of sadness. It was the freezing, clinical clarity of finally seeing the absolute, unvarnished truth of exactly what kind of monster my sister was. Dozens of additional photographs followed throughout the afternoon. Images of Vance aggressively utilizing a drill to install a brand new, unauthorized deadbolt lock on my front door. Pictures of Chloe's chaotic crayon drawings being messily taped to the stainless steel of my refrigerator. A final photograph of Bethany posing triumphantly in my kitchen, holding a large glass of red wine, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the theft. They were actively making themselves completely at home in my sanctuary. They possessed absolutely no idea that they were enthusiastically decorating a condemned demolition site. On the 10th of January, I sat in a dimly lit, aromatic coffee shop located exactly 3 blocks from my massive new corporate office building out west. My laptop was open on the wooden table, and I was quietly watching the relentless coastal rain trace intricate patterns down the massive pane glass windows. The exhausted barista had wildly misspelled my name on the cardboard cup, writing Clara as Cara. But I did not mind the error in the slightest. Out here, in this sprawling, wet metropolis, I possessed the ultimate freedom to be absolutely anyone I chose. My encrypted phone vibrated against the table. It was Julian Thorne. "The transaction is completely finalized," he announced, his voice strictly professional. "The closing was executed flawlessly. The massive transfer of funds has been routed and cleared into your primary accounts." I opened my secure banking application and stared at the digital balance. It was a staggering, almost incomprehensible number. It was significantly more capital than I had ever possessed at one singular time. It was enough wealth to completely start over without fear. It was enough security to ensure I would never have to look backward. "And the legal notification timeline?" I asked, my voice completely steady. "Victor Sterling's corporate legal team will physically post the municipal demolition notice on the front door within 7 to 10 business days. It mandates a strict, unalterable 30-day vacate period immediately following the posting. Thank you so much for everything, Julian." Clara, his usually clinical voice softened significantly. "Are you absolutely, undeniably certain you want to proceed with this? Once that neon notice goes up on that door, there is absolutely zero legal mechanism to reverse it." I thought about the smug, triumphant sequence of Bethany's social media stories. I thought about my mother's terrifyingly confident, cruel assurance that I would simply pout and get over the theft of my own home. I thought about my cowardly father, who had accepted my spare key and looked me in the eye without a single question or warning. "I am absolutely certain," I replied, my voice hard as diamond. "Very well then," he paused, a heavy breath echoing over the line. "For whatever it is worth to your soul, I strongly believe you are executing the absolute right decision to save yourself." We disconnected the call. I gently closed the lid of my laptop and wrapped both of my freezing hands completely around the warm paper coffee cup, allowing the intense heat to slowly seep into my numb fingers. Outside the window, the foggy, rainy city went about its chaotic, gray business. Total strangers were rushing past walking damp dogs. Couples were huddled intimately under shared umbrellas. Thousands of anonymous people were living incredibly complex lives that possessed absolutely nothing to do with my trauma. I felt incredibly strange. I did not feel a rush of triumphant victory. I did not feel a dark, vindictive joy. I just felt inexplicably, wonderfully light. I felt exactly like a prisoner who had finally set down a suffocating boulder she had been carrying for so many decades that she had forgotten it was not a biological part of her own anatomy. My phone buzzed again. A rapid text message from Maya. "How is your mental state holding up out there?" I typed back a rapid response. "Significantly better than I ever anticipated. The demolition notice goes out very soon. Are you psychologically prepared for the absolute hellfire that comes next?" I watched the heavy rain violently strike the glass. I have been preparing for this war for my entire life. The 18th of January. I was sitting quietly in the middle of an intensive morning strategy meeting when my phone began violently vibrating in my pocket. Once, twice, a third consecutive time. I blindly reached into my pocket, silenced the device entirely, and forced my attention back to the projected financial presentation. When I finally broke for a late lunch and unlocked the screen, I was greeted by 17 missed calls. The very first frantic voicemail was from my mother. "Clara Elizabeth, you need to call me back this exact secondary minute. What in the name of God have you done? What on earth have you done to us?" The second frantic message was from Bethany. Her voice was shrill, completely unhinged with raw panic. "Clara, there are strange men in suits here aggressively taping legal documents to the front door. They're explicitly telling us that we legally have to vacate the premises in 30 days or face armed removal. Clara, this absolutely has to be some sort of insane clerical mistake. Call me back immediately." The third voicemail was from Vance, his voice booming with aggressive, masculine entitlement. "This is absolutely insane behavior, Clara. You cannot legally sell a residential property while human beings are actively inhabiting it. We are contacting a ruthless attorney today." The fourth message was from my father. He did not utter a single word. He simply left a terrifying, 10-second recording of his own heavy, panicked breathing before abruptly hanging up the phone. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat of my car, parked in the concrete labyrinth of the corporate garage, and began meticulously scrolling through a mountain of text messages that aggressively ranged from deeply confused to violently furious to pathetically desperate. Bethany, you need to call me this instant. Mom, how could you possibly inflict this kind of trauma upon your own sister? Bethany, the children are absolutely terrified right now. Clara. Mom, we raised you to possess significantly better morals than this. Vance, you will be hearing from our aggressive legal counsel by the end of the day. Bethany, I looked up the municipal property records online. You actually sold it. You actually sold the property to a corporation. Mom, your poor father is experiencing severe chest pains because of the stress you caused. Bethany, 30 days, Clara. Where on earth are we supposed to go in 30 days? I read every single digital message incredibly carefully. I scrutinized every word. Not a single one of those messages contained the words "I am sorry." Not a single one of them acknowledged the terrifying reality that they had actively conspired to steal my sanctuary without my knowledge. Not a single one of them bothered to ask if I was emotionally stable, or why I had executed such a drastic maneuver, or what horrific actions had driven us to this catastrophic breaking point. They were absolutely not angry that they had been caught committing a profound moral crime. They were exclusively, violently angry that I had outsmarted them and refused to let them win. My phone began vibrating again. The caller ID flashed Bethany's name. I sat in silence and watched the letters glow on the screen until the call finally rolled over to voicemail. Then I powered the device completely down. Let me pause the narrative here for a second. If you are still walking alongside me in this story, if this specific kind of toxic family dynamic is hitting dangerously close to your own reality, please take a deep breath. Drink a glass of water. I am fully aware that navigating this level of psychological warfare is incredibly intense. And if you are finding validation in my journey, please hit that like button. It truly helps push these stories to the people who need to hear them. Now, I have a vital question for you. What exactly do you believe happens next? Will my family eventually break down and offer a genuine apology, or will they aggressively double down on their own victimhood? Tell me your absolute best prediction down in the comments section. Now, let me reveal exactly how the final act played out. Over the course of the next 48 agonizing hours, my cellular phone transformed into a relentless, buzzing weapon. 79 missed phone calls. 47 desperate text messages. 12 hysterical voicemails. For lengthy, threatening emails. I meticulously documented absolutely everything. I captured high-resolution screenshots, logged exact timestamps, and transcribed the audio messages. I did not hoard this evidence because I possessed some grand plan to use it in a courtroom, but because I intimately understood how terrifyingly quickly my family was capable of rewriting historical facts to suit their narrative. I desperately needed a permanent, undeniable record of exactly who these monsters truly were when they believed the rest of the world was not watching. The barrage of messages followed a highly predictable, clinical psychological pattern. Stage 1 was pure confusion. There absolutely must be a clerical error at the bank. Please just call us and explain. Stage 2 morphed into violent anger. How dare you inflict this kind of horrific pain upon your own bloodline? Stage 3 devolved into heavy emotional blackmail. Mom has not stopped violently sobbing for 2 days. Dad's blood pressure is spiking to stroke levels. Stage 4 escalated into empty legal threats. Vance's cousin is a paralegal and we are aggressively exploring all of our litigation options against you. Stage 5 finally collapsed into pathetic bargaining. Please, Clara, just answer the phone. We can sit down and work out a compromise. Please. What absolutely none of them managed to articulate was, we are incredibly sorry we premeditated a plot to steal your home without your permission. What none of them possessed the integrity to admit was, we were entirely in the wrong. Bethany's specific messages were by far the most psychologically revealing. You explicitly knew we were moving our family in here, and you maliciously sold it anyway. She never once said, I am sorry I attempted to steal your most valuable asset behind your back. The innocent children are crying themselves to sleep every single night. They genuinely believed this was going to be their permanent new bedroom. She never once acknowledged, "We should have asked for your explicit legal permission before invading your space." How on earth am I supposed to explain this devastating eviction to little Chloe and Mason? She phrased it exactly as if I had aggressively created this catastrophic housing crisis out of thin air. As if the tears of her children were somehow my moral responsibility to dry. I digitally saved every single message to a secure cloud folder. Then, I closed the laptop screen, walked out of my apartment, and took a long, grounding walk along the rain-slicked Seattle waterfront. The crisp, cold air smelled intensely of salt water and pine needles. Angry seagulls argued fiercely over discarded scraps near the bustling fish market stalls. Hundreds of complete strangers walked right past me without offering a single, lingering glance. I had never felt so beautifully, profoundly invisible in my entire life. I had never felt so undeniably, intoxicatingly free. On the 21st of January, exactly 3 days after the bright neon demolition notice was taped to the door, I officially broke my radio silence. I drafted one single, incredibly precise email. It was addressed to my mother, my father, Bethany, and Vance, and it was officially carbon copied to my attorney, Julian Thorne. I wrote the message sitting quietly at the small kitchen table in my temporary Western apartment, a steaming cup of herbal tea slowly growing cold beside my keyboard. I obsessively revised the text 6 separate times before I finally possessed the courage to hit the send button. Subject line: regarding the commercial property located at address. To my family. I have officially and legally sold my condominium, a property that I purchased exclusively with my own heavily earned capital and owned solely under my legal name, to a commercial development corporation. This transaction was executed entirely within my absolute legal rights as a property owner. I am now fully aware that several of you chose to physically move your belongings into the property without securing my knowledge, my legal consent, or my authorization during my scheduled absence. The new corporate owners have officially issued a standard, non-negotiable 30-day notice to vacate the premises, as is their absolute right under the constraints of their municipal demolition permit. I will absolutely not be discussing this specific matter any further. If you urgently require assistance locating new residential housing, I strongly recommend directly contacting the Municipal Housing Authority or similar local emergency resources. This serves as my final and absolute communication regarding this subject. Clara. I did not offer a single word of explanation. I did not hurl emotional accusations. I did not provide an exhaustive catalog of their historical offenses or detail the agonizing depth of my pain. I simply stated the unalterable legal facts, and I permanently deadbolted the psychological door. The frantic responses flooded my inbox incredibly quickly. From Bethany, "That is it? That is absolutely all you have to say to your own sister?" From Vance, "This situation is absolutely not over, Clara." From my mother, "I honestly do not even recognize who you are anymore." The sweet, compliant daughter I raised would never, ever be capable of being so incredibly cruel. I calmly read every single message, and then I permanently archived the entire thread. My mother's venomous words were explicitly designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Perhaps, in a past, weaker version of my life, they would have successfully shattered me. But something fundamental had permanently shifted deep inside my architecture. A heavy, iron door had slammed shut, and a heavy lock had been turned. The compliant daughter she believed she raised would have immediately apologized, would have wept uncontrollably, would have desperately found a way to financially bleed herself dry to make everyone else comfortable, all while actively shrinking herself into absolute nothingness. That specific, pathetic version of the daughter simply did not exist on this earth anymore. I gently closed the lid of my laptop and sat in the quiet, watching the relentless, heavy rain fall steadily over the dark waters of Puget Sound. The toxic family grapevine operated with terrifying, lightning-fast efficiency. Within a single week, my phone was inundated with aggressive messages from 3 outraged aunts, 2 confused uncles, and a distant cousin I had not spoken a single word to since my high school graduation. The false narrative had perfectly crystallized into absolute fact within the family ecosystem. Clara maliciously sold her house out of pure, unadulterated spite while her poor, struggling sister's innocent family was actively seeking shelter there. There was absolutely zero mention of the deceptive, thieving scheme hatched in the kitchen over the holiday dinner. There was zero acknowledgement of the fact that they had violently invaded my home and changed the locks without a shred of permission. The entire narrative was simply reduced to, how could you possibly inflict such cruelty upon poor Bethany? Aunt Beatrice aggressively telephoned me twice. I allowed both calls to roll directly to voicemail. Clara, honey, this is your Aunt Beatrice. I just desperately wanted you to know that your poor mother is completely, utterly devastated by your actions. Absolutely destroyed. She keeps weeping and saying she simply does not understand where she went wrong in raising you. I strongly believe you owe her a massive, public apology, do you not think? Family is blood, after all. Please call me back immediately. I permanently deleted the audio message without a second thought. Some of the more dramatic relatives simply stopped acknowledging my existence entirely. I could physically see the blocked digital notifications, the aggressively unanswered friend requests, the sudden, deafening social media silence. I was being actively, intentionally erased from the grand family narrative, written out of the script exactly like a minor character who had suddenly outlived her financial usefulness. But not every single person blindly followed the mandated script. A completely unexpected text message arrived from my great-aunt Cordelia, my late grandmother's youngest sister. She was 83 years old and had historically always served as the family's quiet, incredibly sharp-eyed observer. Clara. I absolutely do not know the entire, unvarnished story, and I am not going to pry and ask you for it. But I have sat quietly and watched you aggressively take care of the financial burdens of that family for years, while they did absolutely nothing but take and take from you. Whatever truly happened in that house, I intrinsically trust that you possessed profound, undeniable reasons for doing what you did. I am incredibly proud of your strength. I sat on my couch and read that glowing message 3 separate times. Then I broke down and cried. Not from a place of suffocating sadness, but from the overwhelming, tidal wave relief of finally being truly, accurately seen. One single human being. One person in my entire sprawling family tree completely understood the reality of the dynamic. I typed back through blurry eyes. Thank you so deeply, Aunt Cordelia. You have absolutely no idea how much those words mean to me right now. Her reply materialized almost instantly. Sometimes, my sweet girl, the absolute bravest, most terrifying thing a human can do is to simply walk away. Stay incredibly strong. I saved a screenshot of that specific message in a secure digital folder, hoarding it for the inevitably hard, lonely days that lay ahead. The absolute, unalterable 30-day eviction deadline finally arrived in the middle of February. I eventually learned the chaotic, humiliating details entirely secondhand through Maya, who had received the gossip from a mutual acquaintance still deeply embedded in the East Coast social circle. Bethany and Vance possessed absolutely nowhere else to go. Vance's parents, who had been fiercely estranged for years over a massive sum of money he had borrowed and aggressively refused to repay, completely declined to offer shelter. His brother's studio apartment was vastly too small to house a family of 4. Their sprawling network of enabler friends suddenly, miraculously remembered prior, unalterable commitments. In the bitter end, they were forced to physically move their entire lives into my parents' suburban house. A cramped, 3-bedroom house suddenly occupied by 6 highly volatile human beings. My mother's meticulously controlled, pristine kingdom was violently overrun with noisy toy trucks, spilled sippy cups, screaming children, and an incredibly lazy son-in-law she had always secretly despised. Eleanor is absolutely losing her mind over there, Maya reported gleefully during one of our marathon phone calls. Apparently, she completely failed to realize that offering to help Bethany financially was a vastly different reality than being forced to physically live with Bethany. How are the innocent kids handling it? I asked, feeling a brief, sharp pang. The kids are completely fine. Children are incredibly resilient creatures. It is strictly the entitled adults who are absolutely drowning in the misery of their own making. I felt a strange, complicated twisting sensation deep inside my chest. It was guilt, perhaps. Or maybe just the lingering, haunting ghost of guilt I was conditioned to feel. They consciously made their own destructive choices, Clara, Maya added gently, sensing my hesitation over the line. You are absolutely not morally responsible for shielding them from the consequences of their own actions. I know that logically, I sighed. Do you truly know that, though? Maya pressed. I remained completely quiet for a long moment, watching the coastal fog roll in. I am aggressively working on internalizing it. A week later, I accidentally stumbled across a public social media post uploaded by Bethany. There were no curated photographs attached this time, just a block of dramatic text. Sometimes, the specific people you trust the most in this world let you down the absolute hardest. But we are true survivors. We will eventually get through this nightmare. The comment section was overflowing with performative sympathy, strings of broken heart emojis, praying hands, and dark promises that cosmic karma would aggressively handle whoever had inflicted this pain upon her. I was permanently cast as the dark villain of her carefully curated story now. I was the cruel, heartless sister who had maliciously abandoned her vulnerable family in the snow. Later that exact same afternoon, I received one final, cryptic message from my father. I am so sorry. Just 4 devastating words. Absolutely no further explanation, no context, no ownership of the crime. I stared at the glowing letters on the screen for a very long time, desperately trying to decode their true meaning. Was he genuinely sorry for what he had actively participated in? Was he sorry for the horrific abuse he had allowed to occur? Was he apologizing for the daughter he had permanently lost, or was he simply lamenting the chaotic, overcrowded house he was currently trapped inside? I permanently saved the message, but I absolutely refused to offer a reply. Spring finally arrived in my new coastal city, blooming like a quiet, whispered promise of rebirth. I successfully secured a permanent lease on a beautiful apartment near a massive, serene lake. It was a modest studio, but it featured towering, floor-to-ceiling windows and offered a breathtaking view of blooming cherry blossom trees. The property landlord was a sweet, retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Gable, who blessedly asked absolutely zero probing personal questions and consistently kept a fresh plate of warm cookies in the lobby. My new corporate position was incredibly demanding, but deeply, profoundly fulfilling. I was highly paid to aggressively analyze systemic risks for a living. And for the very first time in my existence, I was successfully applying those exact same analytical skills to my own personal life. I was coldly calculating the true emotional cost of my relationships. I was meticulously measuring the return on my psychological investments. The emotional math was absolutely not complicated. Prior to moving, I had quietly donated the vast majority of my East Coast furniture to a local women's domestic violence shelter. The massive influx of capital from the commercial condo sale went directly into heavily diversified investment accounts, robust retirement funds, aggressive emergency savings, and a substantial, anonymous financial contribution to a university scholarship program specifically designed for first-generation college students fighting to escape poverty. I privately referred to it as the Clara Independence Fund. Absolutely nobody else on Earth needed to know it existed. Maya flew out to visit me for a long weekend in late April. We sat closely together on my tiny, wrought iron balcony, wrapped tightly in heavy wool blankets, quietly drinking wine and watching the spectacular sunset paint the distant, snow-capped mountains in brilliant shades of pink and spun gold. You seem fundamentally different, she observed softly, swirling her glass. How exactly do you mean? You seem incredibly light. It looks exactly like you finally put down a massive boulder you have been carrying. I thought deeply about that observation. I genuinely think I did. Do you harbor any lingering regrets? The massive question hung suspended in the freezing air between us. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I deeply miss who I falsely thought they were, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I miss the warm, comforting fantasy of the family I imagined I belonged to. But I absolutely do not miss the reality of who they actually were. Maya nodded slowly, understanding the profound distinction. That makes total, logical sense. I historically used to believe that the concept of home was a physical location, I continued, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders. Then, for a while, I desperately thought home was composed of specific people. Now I firmly believe. I paused, desperately searching the horizon for the exact right words to express the feeling. I think that home is simply the physical and mental space where absolutely nobody is permitted to violently harvest pieces of your soul. She reached across the small table and squeezed my freezing hand tightly. "You're going to be absolutely fine, Clara." I looked out at the towering mountains, at the sprawling, bruised sky, at the entirely blank, unwritten map of the life spreading out before me. "Yes," I said, a genuine smile breaking across my face. "I really think I am." 6 full months later, the screen of my phone unexpectedly buzzed with a notification that made my heart temporarily stop. It was a direct text message from Bethany. It was her very first attempt at direct communication since I sent my final, absolute email back in January. I stared at the notification badge, my thumb hovering over the delete option. I almost wiped it from existence unread. But some strange, unnameable emotion, perhaps morbid curiosity, or perhaps the lingering, stubborn ghost of sisterly affection, compelled me to tap the screen and open the message. "Clara, I am fully aware that you probably never want to hear from me again. I absolutely do not blame you if you instantly delete this message. But I desperately wanted you to know. I finally secured a full-time, salaried position. Vance and I managed to secure the lease on a modest apartment. We officially moved out of Mom and Dad's house late last month. I am absolutely not contacting you to ask for a single favor or a dime of money. I have been spending a lot of time thinking deeply about everything that transpired. I am not emotionally ready to say anything more profound than that right now. But I am genuinely trying. I just wanted you to know that I am trying." I read the block of text 3 separate times, analyzing every single syllable. There was absolutely no direct apology. There was zero formal acknowledgement of the horrific theft she had plotted. It was simply a fragile status update. It was absolutely not enough to heal the wound. Not yet. Perhaps it would never be enough to repair the breach. But it was undeniably something. It was a crack in her impenetrable armor. I did not type a reply immediately. I put on my shoes and went for a long, grueling run along the perimeter of the lake, allowing the freezing morning air to completely clear the fog from my head. I thought critically about what Bethany's message truly meant, and more importantly, what it did not mean. She was attempting to try, perhaps. Or, cynically, she was simply laying the initial, manipulative groundwork for her next massive financial ask. The next inevitable, entitled claim on my personal resources. I simply could not know her true intentions for certain. And for the very first time in my 31 years of existence, I realized with absolute clarity that I did not need to know. The heavy, iron door I had violently slammed shut did not have to remain permanently locked forever. But I was the only person who possessed the key, and I exclusively got to dictate when, how, and if that door ever cracked open again. Late that evening, sitting at my desk, I finally typed a response. "Thank you for letting me know." Exactly 6 words. Absolutely nothing more. Bethany's reply materialized minutes later. "Okay." And that was the absolute end of the exchange. I gently set my phone face down on the desk and looked out at the glittering skyline of my new city, the vibrant lights perfectly reflecting off the dark water like thousands of scattered, floating stars. I possessed absolutely no idea what the distant future held. But for the very first time in my entire life, that future was entirely, undeniably mine to decide. I have spent countless, quiet hours attempting to psychologically dissect exactly why my family committed the atrocities they did. I do not do this to excuse their horrific behavior. I will never, ever excuse it, but to fully understand the mechanics of it. Because understanding the architecture of abuse is exactly how you ensure you never repeat the toxic patterns. Bethany and my mother operated from a deeply diseased, fundamental belief system that was so aggressively ingrained in their DNA that they probably lacked the capacity to even recognize it. They genuinely believed that the concept of family meant the absolute, forced communal sharing of all resources, and that whoever possessed slightly more was biologically obligated to surrender it to those who possessed less. It was pure, unadulterated entitlement brilliantly camouflaged in the manipulative language of maternal love. My mother genuinely viewed herself as the ultimate protector. She had spent her entire adult life aggressively shielding Bethany from the natural consequences of her own terrible choices, which ultimately meant that Bethany never intellectually learned that consequences even existed in the real world. When you are continuously raised to falsely believe that the universe inherently owes you comfort, you completely stop questioning whether you have actually done the work to earn it. And Bethany, she was not born inherently maliciously cruel. She was actively molded by her toxic environment. She was shaped by the constant reinforcement of being the eternally struggling victim. The golden child who endlessly received pity and bailouts instead of rigid accountability. The act of aggressive taking became completely normalized to her. It became expected. It became her perceived divine right. And then, there was me. I was the classic, textbook overfunctioner. I was the silent fixer. I was the exhausted pack mule who desperately kept the fragile piece of the house by systematically sacrificing microscopic pieces of my own soul, pieces so small I barely even noticed I was bleeding out. Until one fateful day, I finally looked in the mirror and realized with absolute terror that I had given away every single component of my identity except for my name. The brutal, unvarnished truth about being designated as the family's automated teller machine is this: the exact moment you finally disable the cash dispenser and establish a boundary, you immediately discover exactly what your true value was to them. If you are sitting there listening to my voice and you are recognizing the painful reflection of your own life in my words, if you are the designated workhorse who endlessly gives, who never dares to ask for help, who aggressively smooths over every single toxic conflict at the severe, agonizing cost of your own mental health, I desperately need you to hear this truth. You are fully, legally, and morally allowed to stop. You are absolutely allowed to look them in the eye and say no. You are entirely allowed to love your family from a distance, while simultaneously walking away to save your own life. Setting aggressive, non-negotiable boundaries is absolutely not an act of cruelty. It is the most fundamental act of survival. It is also the only mathematical way to truly discover if a person genuinely loves your soul, or if they simply love the resources your soul provides for them. Ask yourself this terrifying question tonight: if I completely stopped providing, fixing, and giving, would they still bother to call my phone? The honest answer might completely shatter your heart into a million pieces. But I promise you, that exact same shattered heart will eventually set you completely, undeniably free. And that is the unvarnished truth of my story. If you have chosen to stay with me until the very end of this journey, I thank you from the absolute bottom of my heart. I would love nothing more than to hear from you. Have you ever been forced to set a terrifying, life-altering boundary with your own toxic family members? How exactly did the fallout unfold? What profound lessons did you extract from the ashes? Please drop your personal story down in the comments section. I promise you, I read every single one. And if my journey resonated deeply with your own spirit, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the similar stories of survival linked in the description below. Please, take aggressive care of yourselves out there. You absolutely deserve peace.